My husband
Babe, wait.
swore she was just a coworker. Then our son called her mom, and I found her number saved in his
Babe,
phone
wake
as
up.
home.
Something's wrong.
On today's episode of The Wander's Tales, we dive where quiet courage prevails. Hidden truths and hearts so bold, stories of fear left untold. If this calls to you, don't delay, subscribe, tap the bell, and stay with us. Thank you. The sun dipped below the Atlantic horizon, painting the Lagos skyline in bruised purples and molten golds, a scene that looked exactly like the life Ngozi had carefully curated for herself. Standing on the balcony of their Ikoyi penthouse, she adjusted the silk of her emerald wrapper, feeling the weight of the heavy gold jewelry that marked her as the wife of Kofi Mensah, the man whose name was whispered in the corridors of power. Below, the city hummed with a chaotic energy, the distant honking of yellow Danfo buses, the rhythmic thrum of diesel generators, and the smell of roasting maize rising from the street vendors. Everything felt solid, expensive, and permanent, a testament to a decade of building a legacy together. When Kofi stepped onto the balcony, the scent of his expensive oud preceded him, and for a moment, Ngozi felt that familiar rush of pride. He looked every bit the visionary architect he was, his posture radiating the confidence of a man who had built empires from dust. As they prepared to head to the annual Builders' Gala, he checked his watch with a slight frown, mentioning that he had to send a quick brief to Amina, a new junior associate he'd mentioned in passing over the last few months. Ngozi smiled, offering a supportive nod, unaware that the name Amina was not just a footnote in his professional life, but the first tremor of an earthquake that would eventually swallow her whole. The gala was a blur of flashing cameras and polite laughter, but Ngozi noticed how Kofi's phone buzzed incessantly in his pocket, a frantic heartbeat that seemed out of sync with his calm exterior. Inside the ballroom of the Eco Hotel, the air was thick with the scent of lilies and the perfume of the Lagos elite, a world where appearances were the only currency that truly mattered. Ngozi moved through the crowd with the grace of a woman who knew she was envied, her hand resting lightly on Kofi's arm as they navigated the sea of handshakes and air kisses. It was during a conversation with the Minister of Works that the name surfaced again, not from Kofi's lips, but from a colleague who praised the seamless collaboration between Kofi and Amina on the new waterfront project. "She's a powerhouse," the man said, leaning in with a conspiratorial wink. "Kofi is lucky to have someone who understands his vision so intuitively, almost as if they share the same mind." Kofi's laugh was a fraction too loud, a sharp sound that pierced the carefully modulated atmosphere of the room, and he quickly pivoted the conversation towards steel imports and urban planning. Ngozi felt a momentary prickle of intuition, a cold draft in a room filled with warmth, but she brushed it aside as the paranoia of a long day. She watched her husband, admiring the way he commanded the room, his eyes bright with ambition and a secret energy she couldn't quite name. Later that night, as they drove home in the cushioned silence of their SUV, the city lights blurred into long streaks of neon, and Kofi fell asleep against the window, his phone still clutched in his hand. Ngozi looked at him, her heart full of a love that felt as vast as the ocean they were driving beside, never suspecting that the man sleeping next to her was a stranger, or that the coworker was currently waiting in a house she didn't know existed, living a life that was meant to be hers. The following Saturday was a rare pocket of domestic peace, the kind of morning where the humidity of Lagos felt like a soft blanket rather than a heavy weight. Tobai, their 7-year-old son, was sprawled on the Moroccan rug in the living room, his tongue poked out in concentration as he colored a sprawling map of an imaginary city. Ngozi watched him from the kitchen island, sipping a glass of freshly pressed hibiscus tea, marveling at how much he looked like Kofi, the same high cheekbones, the same intense focus, the same way his brow furrowed when he was thinking. Kofi was in his home office, the muffled sounds of a Zoom call filtering through the heavy oak door, leaving the two of them in a bubble of quiet contentment. As the afternoon drifted into evening, Tobai grew tired, his movements becoming sluggish and his eyes heavy with the kind of exhaustion only a child can carry. Ngozi knelt beside him, beginning the nightly ritual of gathering toys and preparing for the bath, when Tobai suddenly paused, his crayon hovering over the page. "Mom, can we call Amina before I go to sleep?" he asked, his voice casual and devoid of any guile. The air in the room seemed to vanish, leaving Ngozi gasping in a vacuum of sudden, sharp confusion that made her ears ring. She forced her voice to remain steady, though her heart had begun to hammer against her ribs like a trapped bird. "Amina, you mean Daddy's coworker from the office, Tobai?" she asked, her smile feeling like a mask that was beginning to crack. Tobai looked up, his expression innocent and confused by her confusion, his small hand reaching out to touch her arm. "No," he whispered, his eyes widening as if he'd realized he'd broken a rule he didn't fully understand. "I mean the other mom, the one who smells like vanilla and tells me the stories about the stars." The silence that followed was deafening, a thick, suffocating thing that filled every corner of the vast, open-plan house. Ngozi felt a cold shiver crawl down her spine, the kind of primal warning that precedes a disaster, as she looked at her son and saw a shadow of a secret she wasn't supposed to know. Before she could probe further, the door to the office swung open and Kofi stepped out, his face pale and his eyes darting between Ngozi and Tobai with a frantic, animal energy. He moved quickly, scooping Tobai up into his arms with a laugh that sounded hollow and forced, a jagged sound that tore through the tension. "He's just tired, Ngozi," Kofi said, his voice dropping into that soothing, manipulative tone he used when he was closing a difficult deal. "He's been spending too much time at the office with me lately, and he's confused her name with yours because they're both associates." He didn't look her in the eye, instead focusing on ruffling Tobai's hair, his fingers trembling slightly as he steered the boy toward the stairs. Tobai remained silent, his face buried in his father's shoulder, his earlier confession hanging in the air like a ghost that refused to be exorcised. Ngozi stood frozen in the center of the room, the hibiscus tea forgotten on the counter, the taste of it now bitter on her tongue. She watched them disappear into the upper floor, the sound of their footsteps echoing through the house like a countdown. She told herself it was a mistake, a child's overactive imagination fueled by the presence of a constant professional figure in his father's life, but deep down, in the place where her instincts lived, she knew the truth had just been whispered. The coworker had a name, a scent, and a role in her son's life that transcended the boundaries of an office, and the golden hour of her marriage was beginning to fade into a long, dark night. The blue light of the smartphone screen felt like a laser cutting through the darkness of their master suite, a cold, clinical glow that illuminated the sweat on Ngozi's palms. It was 3 a.m, the hour when the Lagos noise finally dampened to a low thrum, leaving only the sound of Kofi's rhythmic, untroubled breathing beside her. Her heart hammered a frantic rhythm against her ribs, a drumbeat of guilt and desperation that made her feel like a thief in her own home. She had never been the kind of woman to snoop. She had always believed that a marriage without trust was merely a contract written in sand. But Tobai's words, the other mom, had acted like a corrosive acid, eating away at her resolve until only this desperate curiosity remained. She entered the passcode, their wedding anniversary, a sequence of numbers that felt like a mockery as the phone clicked open. She navigated past the professional emails and the group chats filled with architecture blueprints, her eyes scanning for a name that didn't belong. There were no messages from an Amina, no suspicious photos, no digital paper trail of a traditional affair. It was only when she went to the contacts, scrolling past minister and zonal director, that she found it. Saved under home, a designation usually reserved for the landline of a family residence, was a number she didn't recognize. There was no work or office label. It was simply home, a word that implied sanctuary, belonging. And a life lived away from the glass walls of their Ikoyi penthouse. Ngozi stared at the word until it blurred, the 4 letters vibrating with a malevolent energy. In their world, home was this 5-bedroom masterpiece of steel and marble, yet her husband had another destination saved under that sacred title. She felt a sudden, violent urge to press the call button, to see who would answer in the dead of night, to hear the voice of the woman who shared a mental mind with her husband. Her thumb hovered over the screen, trembling with the weight of what she might find, before she pulled back, the cold realization settling in her marrow. This wasn't a hidden mistress kept in a backroom apartment in Surulere. This was something more structural, something embedded in the very architecture of Kofi's life. She looked at the number again, memorizing the digits as if they were a secret code, nodding with a pang of ice that the area code belonged to a quiet, affluent suburb on the outskirts of the city, a place where people went to disappear into domesticity. She carefully placed the phone back on the nightstand, aligning it perfectly with the edge of the mahogany wood so Kofi wouldn't suspect she had moved it. As she lay back down, the silence of the room felt predatory, the shadows stretching across the ceiling like the fingers of a past she was only just beginning to see. The man sleeping next to her, the man who had promised her forever, was a ghost inhabiting a shell, and the real home was somewhere else, waiting for him to return. The humidity of Monday morning clung to the windows of the SUV as Ngozi pulled up to the gates of British International School, the engine idling with a low, expensive purr. Usually, the driver handled the school run, but today Ngozi had insisted, claiming she wanted a few extra minutes of mother-son time before her afternoon meetings. Tobai sat in the back, his eyes fixed on his tablet. His silence since the Amina incident felt like a wall he had built to protect himself from his own honesty. Ngozi watched him through the rearview mirror, her heart aching with a mixture of love and a growing, terrifying suspicion that he was a stranger to her. She walked him to the entrance, the air filled with the scent of expensive laundry detergent and the chatter of other Lagos mothers in their designer gym wear, but her destination wasn't the classroom. After dropping Tobai off, she detoured toward the administration office, her heels clicking on the polished tiles with a sound that felt like a countdown. She told the receptionist, a woman named Mrs. Adebio who had worked there for a decade, that she needed to update their emergency contact information due to a change in their domestic staff. Mrs. Adebio smiled, a practiced, polite expression that didn't reach her eyes, and pulled up Tobai's digital file on the sleek monitor. "Oh, no need to worry, Mrs. Mensah," the woman said, her voice dripping with the effortless professional courtesy of the elite. "Mr. Mensah came in last month and updated everything to ensure there was no lapse in coverage while you were traveling for the luxury summit." Ngozi leaned in, her eyes scanning the screen as Mrs. Adebio scrolled through the fields, and there it was, etched in digital ink like a death warrant. Under the primary emergency contact section, where Ngozi's own name should have been the first line of defense, sat Amina Yusuf. The relationship field was not marked as colleague or employee, but simply left blank, a glaring void that spoke louder than any title could. Below it was the same number she had found in Kofi's phone, the home number, listed as the first point of contact should anything happen to her son. The room seemed to tilt on its axis, the bright fluorescent lights of the office suddenly blinding, as Ngozi realized that, in the eyes of the institution responsible for her child's safety, she was a secondary figure, a footnote in a hierarchy she hadn't known existed. She watched as Mrs. Adebio pointed out that Amina had been the one to sign for Tobai's last 3 early releases for dentist appointments, dates when Kofi had told Ngozi that Tobai was at a friend's birthday party. The betrayal was so methodical, so bureaucratic, that it bypassed rage and went straight to a cold, hollowed-out despair. She thanked the receptionist with a voice that sounded like it belonged to someone else, her movements robotic as she walked back to her car. The sun was now high and harsh, beating down on the asphalt, but Ngozi felt a winter in her chest that no Lagos heat could thaw. She wasn't just being cheated on. She was being erased, systematically replaced by a woman who was already acting as the mother of her child in every record that mattered. 3 days later, the air in the penthouse was charged with the fake energy of a departure, the kind of frantic productivity that precedes a business trip. Kofi was packing a leather Tumi carry-on, his movements precise and practiced, mentioning a sudden, urgent site inspection, in Abuja that would require him to be away for the weekend. Ngozi watched him from the doorway, her arms crossed over her chest, her face a mask of supportive, wifely concern that felt heavier with every passing second. He spoke about soil samples and government contracts, his voice a steady stream of technical jargon designed to dull her senses and prevent any difficult questions. He kissed her on the forehead, the touch feeling like a brand, and promised to call her once he landed, his eyes already looking past her toward the elevator. "Don't work too hard and go," he said, using the pet name that used to make her heart melt but now felt like a taunt. "I'll be back before you even miss me." She watched the elevator doors slide shut, the silence that followed so heavy it felt like it would crack the floorboards. She waited exactly 10 minutes, listening for the sound of his car leaving the compound, before she moved toward the walk-in closet. Her hands were steady as she approached the small digital safe tucked behind his collection of bespoke suits, her mind recalling the code she had glimpsed him typing months ago. The safe beeped and swung open, revealing a stack of documents, some spare foreign currency, and, sitting right on top, Kofi's international passport and his national ID. Ngozi felt a jolt of adrenaline that made her fingertips tingle. He had claimed he was flying to Abuja, but in Nigeria, you couldn't board a domestic flight without that ID, and he certainly wouldn't leave his passport behind if he were truly heading to a high-level government meeting. He had left the house with a suitcase full of clothes, but he wasn't going to the airport. He was going somewhere local, somewhere where he didn't need to prove who he was because they already knew him. The lie was so blatant, so careless, that it felt like an insult to her intelligence, a sign that he believed she was so thoroughly domesticated that she would never look beneath the surface. She closed the safe, her mind racing as she grabbed her own car keys and a pair of dark sunglasses, her resolve hardening into a diamond-sharp focus. She wasn't going to wait for a phone call that would likely be placed from a quiet bedroom 30 minutes away. She was going to follow the breadcrumbs of his deception to the very end. As she descended to the garage, the humid air of the parking level felt like a challenge, a reminder that the city was a labyrinth of secrets, and she was finally ready to navigate the dark corners of her own marriage. She started her car, the engine a low growl in the stillness, and began the slow, agonizing process of tailing a man who had already left her long before he walked out the door. Following a car in Lagos traffic is both an art and a penance, a slow-motion dance through a sea of yellow buses and erratic motorcycles. Ngozi kept 3 cars between her Range Rover and Kofi's silver Mercedes, her eyes fixed on his taillights as they snaked through the congested arteries of Victoria Island and headed toward the Lekki Expressway. The sun was a punishing disk of white fire, making the asphalt shimmer with heat haze, but inside the air-conditioned cabin, Ngozi felt frozen in a state of hypervigilance. She watched as he bypassed the turnoff for the airport, confirmed her suspicion that Abuja was a ghost of a destination, and instead pushed deeper into the suburban sprawl where the gated estates became more secluded and the greenery more lush. The landscape shifted from the high-rise ambition of the city center to the quiet, performative peace of the new Lagos, elite neighborhoods built for families who wanted to hide their wealth behind high walls and electric fences. Kofi eventually turned into a quiet cul-de-sac in a boutique estate called the Palms, a place known for its privacy and its inhabitants' disdain for prying eyes. He pulled into a driveway of a house that looked remarkably like a smaller, more intimate version of their own penthouse, modernist lines, floor-to-ceiling glass, and a garden that looked like it had been tended to with obsessive love. Ngozi parked a block away, tucking her car under the shade of a sprawling flamboyant tree, and watched through the tinted glass as the gates to the house slid shut behind her husband. She sat there for hours, the cabin of her car becoming a confessional where she had to face the reality of her life, watching the shadows lengthen and the streetlights flicker to life. She saw the front door open, and a woman, presumably Amina, stepped out to greet him, her silhouette lit from behind by the warm glow of the foyer. There was no grand, cinematic embrace. Instead, there was a quiet domestic familiarity that was far more devastating. The way she took his coat, the way he rested a hand on the small of her back as they walked inside, the way their movements were perfectly synchronized like a long-married couple. Then, the final blow. Toby appeared in the doorway, running toward Kofi with a joy he hadn't shown in weeks, jumping into his father's arms as if this were the true homecoming he had been waiting for. Ngozi felt a physical pain in her chest, a sensation of her heart being slowly compressed by an invisible hand, as she watched her son, her husband, and a stranger form a tableau of a perfect family. They weren't a secret affair. They were a parallel universe, a life that Kofi had built with the precision of an architect, ensuring that one world never touched the other. She realized then that she wasn't the victim of a momentary lapse in judgment. She was the outlier, the guest in a story that had been written long before she ever arrived on the scene. From her vantage point in the darkened car, Ngozi felt like a ghost haunting the living, a silent observer of a life she was supposed to be leading. The house in the Palms had large, uncurtained windows that acted like a stage, revealing the intimate details of a Saturday evening that felt agonizingly normal. She watched through her binoculars as the three of them sat around a wooden dining table, the light of a chandelier casting a soft, amber glow over their faces. There was no tension, no hushed whispers of guilt, only the easy flow of conversation and the shared laughter of people who were entirely comfortable in each other's presence. She saw Amina dish out food from a large ceramic bowl, the steam rising in the air, and she watched as Toby eagerly accepted a second helping, his face bright with a contentment that Ngozi hadn't seen in their Ikoyi mansion for months. It wasn't just that they were eating together. It was the way they were eating, Kofi leaning in to listen to Toby's stories, Amina reaching over to wipe a smudge of sauce from the boy's cheek, with a tenderness that felt practiced over 1,000 such dinners. This was the home saved in the phone. This was the sanctuary where the masks were removed and the performance of the couple of Lagos was finally allowed to end. The most jarring realization for Ngozi was the lack of otherness in the scene before her. It didn't look like a betrayal, it looked like a foundation. She saw her husband get up to help clear the plates, a task he never performed at home, where a fleet of domestic staff handled every menial chore. Here, in this hidden house, he was a different man, smaller perhaps but more present, his movements devoid of the restless ambition that usually defined him. He looked happy, a simple, uncomplicated kind of happy that Ngozi realized she had never been able to provide, despite all their travels to Paris and their high-society galas. She watched as they moved to the living room, Toby sandwiched between them on a plush sofa as they appeared to watch a movie, the flickering light of the television reflecting in their eyes. For a moment, Amina rested her head on Kofi's shoulder, and he didn't pull away. Instead, he leaned his head against hers, a gesture of such profound intimacy that Ngozi felt a sob catch in her throat. She was looking at a marriage in its truest sense, a partnership of souls that didn't need the validation of a wedding certificate or the approval of Lagos high society. She was the one in the glass house, living a life of cold perfection, while the warmth was here, tucked away in a suburban cul-de-sac, being shared by the people she loved most with a woman she didn't know. The next morning, Ngozi didn't wait for Kofi to return. She waited for him to leave. She watched from her car as his Mercedes pulled out of the driveway at 10:00 a.m., likely heading back to their penthouse to perform the just-landed from Abuja routine. Once his car disappeared around the corner, Ngozi felt a surge of cold, clarifying rage that gave her the strength to step out of her vehicle and walk toward the gate. Her heart was a drum in her ears, each beat a demand for answers that had been denied for years. She pressed the intercom, her voice steady and devoid of emotion as she announced herself simply as Ngozi. There was a long silence, a crackle of static that felt like the world holding its breath, before the electronic gate clicked open with a heavy, mechanical groan. She walked up the driveway, her heels crunching on the gravel, and found Amina standing in the open doorway. Amina was not the villain Ngozi had imagined. She didn't look like a home wrecker or a conniving mistress. She was a woman of quiet, understated elegance, wearing a simple linen dress, her face bare of makeup and her eyes filled with a weary, ancient kind of sadness. She didn't look surprised to see Ngozi. If anything, she looked relieved, as if a long-awaited sentence had finally been delivered. "I've been expecting you for a long time," Amina said, her voice soft and melodious, lacking any trace of the defensiveness Ngozi had prepared to encounter. She stepped aside, gesturing for Ngozi to enter the house that smelled of vanilla and beeswax, the scent Tobai had described. They sat in the sun-drenched living room, the silence between them thick with the weight of a decade of deception. Ngozi opened her mouth to scream, to demand an explanation for the stolen years and the stolen son, but the words died in her throat when she looked at the photos on the mantelpiece. There were no photos of her. There were only photos of Kofi, Amina, and Tobai, spanning back to Tobai's infancy. "I didn't steal him, Ngozi," Amina said, her eyes fixed on a photo of a newborn Tobai in Kofi's arms. "I lent him to you. I lent them both to you because Kofi said you were the only one who could give them the life the world required of them. He said you were the perfect face for the family he needed to build for his career, for his parents, for his legacy." The cruelty of the statement was softened by Amina's tone, which held a strange, disturbing kind of gratitude. "I want to thank you," Amina whispered, reaching out a hand that Ngozi instinctively pulled away from. "Thank you for raising him, for protecting him, and for being the mother he needed while I had to stay in the shadows. I couldn't have done what you did, but I'm so tired of waiting for my life to begin." Ngozi returned to the Ikoyi penthouse that evening, her mind a fractured landscape of Amina's words and the image of those mantelpiece photos. Kofi wasn't home yet. He had called to say his flight was delayed, giving her the window she needed to perform a more thorough excavation of their life. She didn't go to the safe this time. She went to the attic, a space she rarely visited, filled with the ghosts of their 10-year marriage. It was a cavernous room, smelling of cedar and old paper, where the remnants of their past were stored in neat labeled boxes. She searched through the old documents and travel memorabilia, but it wasn't until she pushed aside a stack of heavy winter coats that she found it, a large, antique trunk made of dark wood, secured with a heavy iron padlock. It looked out of place among the modern plastic bins, a relic of a different era, or perhaps a different life. She found a heavy set of pliers in the utility room, and, with a strength born of pure, distilled desperation, snapped the lock. The lid creaked open, releasing a cloud of dust that shimmered in the single light bulb's glow, and Ngozi felt a sense of dread so profound it made her knees weak. Inside the trunk were stacks of envelopes, hundreds of them, all addressed to Tobai. They were organized by year, each bundle tied with a different colored ribbon, a meticulous archive of a mother's love that had never been allowed to reach its destination. Ngozi picked up the top envelope from the most recent stack. It was a birthday card for Tobai's 7th birthday, the one they had celebrated with a 50-guest party at a luxury hotel just 3 months ago. She opened it and read the message inside. Written in the same elegant script she had seen on the blueprints in Kofi's office, "My darling Tobai, another year of watching you grow from afar. Your father tells me you are brave and kind and that you have Ngozi's laugh. I hope one day you will forgive us for the distance. Love, Mom." Ngozi felt the air leave her lungs as if she had been punched. These weren't just letters, they were a timeline of her own displacement. She dug deeper, finding cards for first steps, first teeth, and first days of school, all signed Mom, and all containing references to Amina's stories and Amina's songs. The trunk was a library of a hidden childhood, a record of a family that existed in the margins of her own, and as she sat on the cold attic floor, surrounded by the evidence of her husband's double life, she realized that she had never been a mother in the eyes of the two people who mattered most. She was just the guardian of a secret she hadn't been trusted to keep. The letters in the trunk were more than just birthday greetings. They were a narrative of a romance that predated Ngozi's very existence in Kofi's world. As the night deepened and the sounds of the Lagos traffic faded into a low, predatory hum, Ngozi began to read the older letters, the ones buried at the very bottom of the trunk. These weren't addressed to Tobai, but were letters between Kofi and Amina, written during the early years of their relationship. They spoke of a love that was forbidden by their families, a clash of tribes, of religions, of social expectations that in the traditional corners of Nigeria could still end a future before it began. They spoke of a plan, a strategy devised by a young, ambitious Kofi who was determined to have everything: the woman he loved, the career he craved, and the social standing that required a specific kind of wife. Ngozi is perfect. One letter from Kofi read, dated months before their own wedding. She has the pedigree, the education, and the poise that will open every door. She will be the shield that protects us, Amina. She will be the mother the world sees, and you will be the mother the heart knows. Reading her own name in those letters, seeing herself described as a perfect shield, felt like a soul-deep violation. She saw the calculations behind every romantic gesture Kofi had ever made, the way he had courted her with such intensity, the way he had insisted on a quick marriage, the way he had encouraged her to take Tobai and travel whenever Amina needed time with the boy. She found a letter dated the week of Tobai's birth, where Kofi promised Amina that one day the performance will end, and we will be a family in the light. The cruelty of the deception was breathtaking in its scope. He hadn't just cheated on her. He had recruited her into a lifelong play without her consent, using her beauty and her reputation to validate his own. She realized that every business trip, every late night at the office, and every boys' weekend had been a scheduled appointment for his real life. The unsent letters were the script of her own undoing, a testimony to a man who viewed people as building materials to be manipulated into the structure of his own choosing. She looked at her wedding ring, the diamond glittering mockingly in the dim attic light, and realized it wasn't a symbol of love, but a piece of stage jewelry, a prop in a drama that was finally reaching its final act. Kofi returned the next evening, radiating the faux exhaustion of a man who had spent 3 days in meetings and on-site inspections. He suggested they go to Shiro, one of the most expensive restaurants in Victoria Island, claiming he wanted to make up for being away with a lavish dinner. Ngozi agreed, her voice a flat, dead thing that she carefully masked with a layer of practiced wifely exhaustion. She dressed with obsessive care, choosing a dress that was too bright and jewelry that was too heavy, painting her face into a mask of Lagos perfection that felt like it might crack at any moment. As they sat in the dimly lit restaurant, surrounded by the clinking of crystal and the low murmur of other elite couples, the irony of their situation felt like a physical weight. Kofi was in top form, charming the waiters and regaling Ngozi with fabricated stories about the Abuja heat and the incompetence of the local contractors. He looked at her with a warmth that she now knew was a well-rehearsed lie, his eyes never straying from the performance of the devoted husband. "You look beautiful tonight, Ngo," he said, reaching across the table to take her hand. "I missed this. I missed you." Ngozi let her hand remain in his, but she felt nothing but a cold, clinical detachment. She watched his mouth move, nodding the way his eyes didn't quite crinkle when he laughed, a detail she had overlooked for 10 years but now saw with terrifying clarity. She wondered if he had sat at the wooden table in the Palms just 24 hours ago, saying these same words to Amina, or if with her, he didn't need the performance. She felt a sudden, wicked urge to ask him about the home number, to mention the letters in the attic, to see the mask slip and the architect of her misery be forced to face the wreckage he had created. But she remained silent, playing her part in the drama one last time, observing the way the high society couples around them performed their own versions of domestic bliss. In this world of glass and steel, truth was a liability, and secrets were the mortar that held everything together. She realized that Kofi didn't just love Amina. He loved the structure he had built, the elaborate puzzle that allowed him to have both the status and the soul. As the waiter brought their dessert, a decadent chocolate creation that looked like a work of art, Ngozi felt a wave of nausea. The food tasted like ash, the wine like vinegar, and the man across from her looked like a stranger she had accidentally sat down with for dinner. The final crack in Ngozi's world came not from a letter or a secret phone, but from the unfiltered honesty of her son. It was a Tuesday evening, and the rain was lashing against the penthouse windows, a tropical deluge that turned the city into a blur of gray and green. Kofi was out, another client dinner, and Ngozi was tucking Tobai into bed, the room lit only by the soft glow of a nightlight. Tobai seemed restless, his eyes scanning the shadows of the room as if looking for something that wasn't there. "Mom," he whispered, his voice small and tentative in the vastness of the room. "Is Amina coming to visit soon?" Ngozi felt a jolt of pain, but she forced her voice to remain soft, her hand smoothing the cool sheets over his chest. "Why do you ask, Tobai?" she replied, her heart bracing for the impact. Tobai looked at her, his expression a mix of guilt and a strange, heavy wisdom that no 7-year-old should possess. "She told me that when Daddy is busy with the big meetings, she's the one who stays awake to make sure I'm safe. She said she tucks me in on the nights Daddy goes away, and that we have to call it practice for when she comes home for good." The word practice felt like a knife twist in an old wound. Ngozi realized that while she had been attending galas and building her luxury brand, Amina had been slipping into their home, into her son's life, with the quiet precision of a shadow. She had been practicing being the mother of the house, rehearsing for the day when Ngozi would finally be discarded. "She's very nice, Mom," Tobai continued, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "She says you're the most important lady in Lagos, but she's the one who knows my favorite dreams. She told me I shouldn't tell you because it would make you sad, but I think you're already sad." Ngozi closed her eyes, the tears finally breaking through the levee of her composure. Her son, the boy she had carried, the boy she had stayed awake for during every fever, the boy she had built her world around, was already mentally living in another house, with another woman. He wasn't choosing Amina because he didn't love Ngozi. He was choosing her because he had been taught to, because his father had carefully curated a reality where Ngozi was a figurehead and Amina was the heart. She kissed Tobai's forehead, her lips trembling, and told him to go to sleep, realizing as she walked out of the room that her time in this house, and in this family, had already reached its expiration date. The revelation did not come with a scream or a dramatic flourish, but in the cold, clinical silence of a blue-tinted medical folder Ngozi discovered hidden in the false bottom of the antique trunk. Outside, the Lagos humidity was so thick it felt like breathing through a damp cloth, yet inside the attic, Ngozi felt a bone-deep chill that no tropical sun could touch. She stared at the birth records from a private clinic in Cotonou. Far from the prying eyes of the Lagos social registry where Tobai's birth had been officially celebrated. The documents were undeniable, the blood type, the DNA markers, and the name of the biological mother etched in clear, unyielding ink. Amina Yusuf. The timeline she had lived, the memories of a difficult pregnancy she thought she had endured, began to dissolve like sugar in the rain. She remembered the complications Kofi had cited, the private wing of the hospital where she was kept under heavy sedation, the way the nurses had whisked the baby away, for observation, only to return him hours later. She realized now that the morning sickness she'd felt had been a psychosomatic performance fueled by Kofi's suggestions, perhaps even aided by the vitamin supplements he had insisted she take. She hadn't birthed Tobai. She had been a vessel for a narrative, a woman who had been gaslit into believing her own body had performed a miracle that actually belonged to the woman in the shadows. The betrayal was no longer just about a husband's infidelity. It was a biological heist, a theft of her very identity as a mother, orchestrated by the man who had held her hand while she labored for a child that wasn't hers. As she sat on the dusty floor, the weight of the paper in her hand felt heavier than the penthouse itself, a physical manifestation of a life built on a foundation of air. She looked at a photo of herself holding Toby for the first time, her face pale and exhausted, her eyes filled with a love she thought was rooted in blood. Now she saw the calculation in the frame, Kofi standing behind her, his hand on her shoulder, his eyes not on his wife or the baby, but likely on the door where Amina was waiting to receive her payment in the form of a promised future. Every lullaby she had sung, every fever she had nursed, every scraped knee she had kissed, it was all a service rendered to a family that was not her own. She was the prestigious Ngozi, the woman with the right lineage and the right social standing, hired to be the face of a brand called the Menses. Toby wasn't her son. He was a ward she had been tricked into raising, a beautiful boy who had been lent to her to ensure his father's social ascent. The horror of it was so quiet, so absolute, that she didn't even cry. She simply watched the dust motes dancing in the sliver of light from the attic window, realizing that the woman she had seen in the mirror for the last 7 years was a ghost, a character in a play who had finally looked off stage and seen the director laughing in the wings. Kofi returned home late that night, the scent of expensive gin and the lingering trace of Amina's vanilla perfume clinging to his skin like a second suit. He found Ngozi sitting in the darkened living room, the medical folder resting on her lap like a loaded weapon. When she turned on the lamp, the light caught the sweat on his brow, and for the first time in 10 years, the architect of their life looked like a man who had run out of blueprints. He didn't deny it. The evidence was too clinical, too stark for even his silver tongue to polish. But the breakdown that followed was not the one Ngozi had expected. He didn't fall to his knees and beg for her forgiveness. He didn't weep for the years he had stolen from her or the lies he had forced her to live. Instead, he collapsed into his armchair, burying his face in his hands, and cried out of a sheer, selfish exhaustion. He wasn't crying for Ngozi. He was crying because Amina was tired of waiting, because the pressure of maintaining 2 worlds was finally causing the walls to cave in on him. "She wants her life back, Ngozi," he choked out, his voice thick with a resentment that felt like a slap. "She's tired of being the secret. She's tired of seeing you in the papers, wearing the jewelry she should be wearing, taking the credit for the son she birthed. She's giving me an ultimatum, and I don't know how to fix it without destroying everything I've built." The sheer audacity of his grief was a revelation in itself, a final piece of the puzzle that showed Ngozi exactly where she stood in the hierarchy of his heart. She wasn't the wife who had been wronged. She was the obstacle that was now making his real life difficult. He spoke of the sacrifices he had made to keep them both happy, as if his deception were a noble burden he had carried for their collective benefit. He lamented the unfairness of a society that wouldn't let him marry a woman like Amina without losing the contracts, the prestige, and the approval of his conservative family. To Kofi, Ngozi was a luxury asset that had become too expensive to maintain, a high-end facade that was now cracking and threatening the structural integrity of his true home. As he sobbed, he actually had the nerve to ask her to be reasonable, to help him find a way to transition Amina into their lives without causing a scandal that would ruin his career. He wanted her to participate in her own erasure, to help him architect a new lie that would allow him to have his son, his mistress, and his status all under one roof. Listening to him, Ngozi felt a strange, cold peace settle over her. The man she had loved was a hollowed-out shell, a creature of pure vanity who was incapable of seeing anyone's pain but his own. The marriage wasn't just dead. It had never been alive. It was a business arrangement where she had been the only one who didn't know the terms of the contract. As the night wore on and the rain turned the city into a rhythmic, echoing drum, Kofi began to unravel the history of the ancient pact that had birthed their marriage. It had started years before Ngozi ever stepped into the elite circles of Lagos, back when Kofi and Amina were students with nothing but their ambition and a love that was deemed unacceptable by his traditionalist family. Amina was from the wrong part of the country, the wrong background, and Kofi's father, a man of immense power and rigid expectations, had made it clear: marry a woman of status, or be cut off from the lineage and the capital. They had sat in a small, cramped apartment in Surulere and made a vow that was as romantic as it was monstrous. Amina would stay in the shadows, and Kofi would find a suitable wife, a woman who could act as the social gateway to the life they craved. They looked for someone who was beautiful but not too inquisitive, educated but traditional enough to follow a husband's lead, and prestigious enough to silence any critics. They had scouted Ngozi like a piece of real estate, watching her at gallery openings and charity auctions, noting her kindness and her desire for a family as the perfect vulnerabilities to exploit. They hadn't just fallen into an affair. They had designed a life where Ngozi was the primary investor in a company she would never own. Ngozi listened, her mind flashing back to the early days of their courtship. The way Kofi had seemed to know exactly what to say, how he had integrated himself into her family with such seamless precision. It wasn't love, it was a performance art. He had used her family's connections to secure his first major government contracts, used her reputation as a virtuous woman to build a brand of stability that the banks trusted. And when Amina became pregnant, the plan reached its most grotesque stage. They had used Ngozi's brief medical emergency, a simple procedure she was told was a dreadful miscarriage, to stage a replacement. While she was grieving a loss that hadn't happened, they were preparing a miracle that belonged to Amina. Every time Ngozi had felt guilty for not being mother enough, or every time she had thanked God for the second chance she thought Tobai represented, Kofi and Amina had been watching, perhaps even laughing at the success of their psychological engineering. The pact was a blood bond between two people who were willing to sacrifice a third human being on the altar of their convenience. They had lent Kofi to her, and she had paid for him with her youth, her womb, and her sanity. As the sun began to rise over the Atlantic, casting a pale, sickly light over the penthouse, Ngozi realized that she had been living in a cage of her own making, built with bars of gold and locked with the key of her own trust. The realization that her entire existence had been a lent life was a weight that shifted her perspective on every memory she held dear. She walked through the penthouse, looking at the Italian marble floors, the custom-built library, and the terrace that overlooked the sprawling ambition of Lagos, and realized that none of it was hers, not because she didn't own it on paper, but because she had never truly lived in it. She was the brand manager of a domestic illusion, a high-society nanny who had been given a wedding ring instead of a salary. Every "I love you" from Kofi had been a payment to keep the facade standing. Every kiss was a bribe to ensure she didn't look too closely at the school records or the phone saved as home. She thought of the other wives in their circle, the women who spent their days at the polo club and their nights at the gala, and wondered how many of them were also placeholders, vessels for men who kept their real lives tucked away in the quiet estates of the suburbs. She had been the Mrs. Mensa the world needed, the one who could talk about architecture with the ministers and host the perfect Sunday brunch, while Amina was the Amina Kofi wanted, the one who knew his favorite childhood soup and the sound of his true laughter. The cruelty of being lent a life is that you are never allowed to grow roots. You are always on a temporary lease, subject to the whims of the true owners. Ngozi looked at Tobai's bedroom, with its mural of the solar system and the shelves of books she had read to him every night, and felt a profound sense of mourning for the boy who was never hers. She had loved him with a primal, sacrificial love, only to find out she was a surrogate in a game of emotional chess. She had been hired to provide the social standing and the proper upbringing that Amina, for all her love, could not provide in the eyes of the Lagos elite. She had protected him from the harshness of the world, unaware that she was the one being protected from the truth of his origin. The lent life was a sterile, beautiful thing, but it was devoid of the one thing that made life worth living: truth. She was a woman who had been erased while she was still breathing, replaced by a shadow that had finally decided to step into the light. As she looked out at the city, she realized that the only way to stop being lent was to walk away and find something that was entirely, undeniably hers, even if it meant leaving behind the glass palace and the boy who called her mom, but meant another woman. Lagos is a city of layers, where the moral undertow is as strong as the current at the Lekki beach, pulling beneath the surface of piety and prestige. Ngozi spent the day after the confrontation in a state of hyperanalytical reflection, seeing the cultural machinery that had enabled Kofi's deception. In their world, the appearance of a stable, Christian, high-society marriage was the ultimate currency, the only thing that could bridge the gap between new money and old power. Kofi had understood this better than anyone. He knew that a man with a mistress and an illegitimate child was a cliché, but a man with a perfect wife and a miracle son was a visionary. The society they lived in didn't just allow this kind of deception, it practically demanded it. It was a world that valued the face over the heart, where parents would rather their sons live a lie with a suitable woman than a truth with an unsuitable one. Ngozi realized that she had been a willing participant in this culture of performance, priding herself on her status and her blessed life, without ever questioning the cost of the pedestal she stood upon. She had been the moral shield Kofi used to deflect any suspicion, the virtuous wife who made it impossible for anyone to believe he was capable of such a structural betrayal. The moral undertow had finally dragged her down, exposing the rot beneath the polished surface of her marriage. She thought about the other woman, Amina, and felt a strange, twisted sense of empathy. Amina had also been a victim of this cultural demand for perfection, forced to hide her motherhood and her love in the shadows for a decade, watching another woman live the life she had earned. They were two sides of the same counterfeit coin, both used by a man who saw women as functional objects rather than human beings. The tragedy wasn't just in the affair. It was in the systemic belief that a man's ambition justified the psychological destruction of everyone around him. Ngozi realized that if she stayed, she would be endorsing this moral bankruptcy, becoming a permanent part of the lie to save her own social standing. She looked at the heavy gold cross around her neck, a gift from Kofi on their 5th anniversary, and felt its weight like a shackle. The virtue she had been so proud of was a prison, and the blessings she had counted were just the spoils of a war she hadn't known she was fighting. To find her soul again, she would have to dive into the undertow, let go of the status that had defined her, and swim toward a shore that didn't require a mask to reach. The act of packing was not a frantic, tear-filled scramble, but a slow, methodical ritual of reclaiming her own skin. Ngozi didn't take the designer gowns that Kofi had bought to dress his perfect wife, nor did she take the heavy jewelry that acted as the glittering bars of her cage. She packed only what she had brought into the marriage, the old books from her university days, the few pieces of art she had purchased with her own earnings as a consultant, and the documents that proved she still had a name outside of Mrs. Mensah. She moved through the penthouse like a surveyor, deciding what was her and what was the role. The silence of the house was profound, a vacuum created by the departure of 10 years of noise and pretense. Kofi was gone. He had fled to the office, unable to face the reality of the wreckage, and Tobai was at school, unaware that his world was about to be reconfigured by the woman he called Mom. Every item she placed in her suitcase felt like a pound of weight lifted from her shoulders, a slow stripping away of the Ngozi that had been designed by an architect. She stopped at the nursery, looking at the rocking chair where she had spent 1,000 nights, and for a moment the resolve wavered. The love she felt for Tobai was the only real thing in a decade of ghosts, a tether that threatened to pull her back into the lie. But she knew now that her motherhood was a disservice to him as much as it was to her. If she stayed, she would be teaching him that love is a transaction, that family is a performance, and that women are things to be lent and returned. By leaving, she was giving him the only thing of value she had left, the truth. She left the birthday cards she had found in the attic on his bed, a silent handover of the narrative to the woman who had written them. She didn't leave a note for Kofi. He was a man who only understood blueprints, and she had no interest in helping him rebuild what she was about to tear down. As she zipped her final bag, she looked at the wedding ring on the vanity, a cold circle of diamond and platinum. She left it there, a prop returned to the theater, and walked out of the bedroom without looking back. The penthouse, for all its beauty, was just a set, and the lead actress had finally walked off the stage. Before she left the city for good, Ngozi made one final stop, the house in the Palms. She didn't call ahead, didn't ask for permission. She simply drove through the gates that were now open to her, the home that was finally revealing its secrets. Amina was in the garden, tending to the hibiscus flowers with a quiet, domestic focus that made Ngozi feel like a trespasser in her own life. When Amina looked up, there was no hostility, only a profound, weary recognition. They sat on the patio, the two women who had shared a husband and a child in a decade-long relay race of deception. "I'm leaving," Ngozi said, her voice a clear, resonant sound in the quiet suburb. "The penthouse is yours. The title, the jewelry, the Mrs. Mensah brand, you can have it all. But you should know that the man you've waited for doesn't exist. He only knows how to build facades, and now that the first one has fallen, he will only start building the next one around you." Amina looked at her, and for a moment the mask of the patient lover slipped, revealing a woman who was terrified of the very victory she had won. "I know who he is," Amina whispered, her fingers tracing the rim of her teacup. "But he is the father of my son, and he is the only life I have been allowed to want." The tragedy of the statement hung in the air between them, a reminder that they were both victims of a man who had taught them to value him more than themselves. Ngozi reached out, not to take Amina's hand, but to place Tobai's favorite stuffed lion on the table. "He likes the stories about the stars at 8:00 p.m., Ngozi said, her voice finally breaking. "And he needs to know the truth. Don't let him grow up in a house of mirrors like I did." They sat in silence for a long time, the wife and the mother, realizing that the power shift was final. The Lent life was over, and the right timing Amina had waited for had arrived with a bitterness that no social status could sweeten. As Ngozi walked back to her car, she saw Kofi's Mercedes pulling into the driveway, his face pale with the realization that his two worlds were finally, irrevocably colliding. She didn't stop to talk to him. She simply drove past, the rearview mirror showing a man standing between two women, finally forced to stand in the wreckage of his own design. The drive to the airport was the first time in 10 years that Ngozi felt she was truly steering her own life. The chaos of Lagos, the shouting vendors, the weaving motorcycles, the smell of diesel and salt, didn't feel like a threat anymore, but like a symphony of reality. She was leaving the it couple behind, leaving the penthouse, the luxury brand, and the carefully curated prestige that had been her prison. She was going back to her family's old house in the hills of Enugu, a place where the air was thin and the truth was old, to find the woman she was before she became a perfect shield for an ambitious man. The realization that her love story had ended the day it began was not a tragedy, but a liberation. It meant that everything she had felt, everything she had suffered, was part of a script she was no longer required to follow. She was the protagonist of a new story now, one that didn't require an architect or a hidden mistress to function. As the plane lifted off from the Murtala Muhammad International Airport, Ngozi looked down at the sprawling, glittering grid of Lagos, a city built on dreams and deceptions. She saw the lights of Ikoyi and the dark patches of the outskirts, and she felt a sudden, overwhelming sense of gratitude for the collapse. If the lie hadn't broken, she would have lived her whole life as a ghost, a lent human being who died without ever knowing she was a placeholder. She thought of Tobai, and hoped that one day he would find his way to her in Enugu, not as a son to a mother, but as a person seeking the truth from the only person who had ever been honest enough to leave him. She closed her eyes as the plane pierced the clouds, the sun finally rising above the horizon in a way that didn't feel like a performance. Her marriage was a ghost, her husband was a stranger, and her son was a memory. But for the first time in a decade, Ngozi was real. The story she had been told was over, and the one she was writing for herself was just beginning. A narrative built not on glass and steel, but on the unyielding stone of her own reclaimed soul. I didn't lose a husband, I just returned a man I never truly owned. She didn't steal my life, she just lent it to me until the timing was right. Now I have to ask, would you stay for the sake of the family or walk away to save your soul? Let me know in the comments.